So there's a scarcity mindset. And then it doesn't help that in the media, all they're talking about is immigrants and the negative side of things and who's going to pay for this cost. And so I think Sirat, unfortunately and unwittingly, becomes a product of that type of environment, a product of the anti immigrant sentiment. And the book shows that you really can't escape that poisonous thinking in the way that you think you can.
Hello and welcome back to Sòrò, sókè. This is a podcast created to learn, understand, and demystify African lives and African people. Thank you so much for joining me today, Salma. I am so honored and pleased and just very happy for you to be here. And I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. Today's topic is on finding a home. And we are doing a book review. This book has so many topics I would love to delve into and have a deeper discussion with you. But first of all, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there. Thank you so much, Zainab, for inviting me onto Sarasake. I really appreciate the chance to be able to talk about Salutation Road. Um, and just to introduce myself, I am the author of Salutation Road, which came out in February. It's a novel about a young woman who is transported to a parallel universe where she sees what her life would be like if her family hadn't left during the Somali civil war. So it's a story about the question behind what if that's explored through the parallel world. It's about family, secrets, grief, love. And aside from that, I work in the humanitarian space as a marketing manager. Um, and I just love storytelling in all of its forms.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so just to delve into it, one of the things that I love the most about your book and the way you've done the journey so well is that it's not romanticized at all. And there was a few bits and loads of few bits that I was just like, no, like I was just, angry with with Sarah, the main character. There was sorrows that were kind of like not finished and like it wasn't packaged all very pretty with the pink bow, and there was conversation that I felt like it should have done been the other way, questions, and I really enjoyed that this book didn't try and solve the questions and package it all well and kind of give you a completed solution or what if this is it. There's a lot more questions, and again, like in the book specifies, Sirad went through this journey, and she even mentions that going through the journey has created more questions, and I think the reader also as goes through this journey with the book. So you start with some questions, but I feel like you end with even more questions, which is very similar. I think a good parallel with Sarah, the main character. Disclaimer: there will be spoilers. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about the book in details, but I do recommend everyone to get the book. I will put the link of where to get it in the description below. Okay, so first of all, Sirat. Like, I want to mainly go into different characters and then we can delve into them a little bit more. So at the beginning, we get a good description of Sirad, and Sirad lives in London, specifically in Greenwich. And she's, I would say, like an ordinary girl who happens to be Muslim. And she kind of is going through life in her 20s, and there's a lot of difficulties in her personal life, but also in her own kind of like um, desires and aspiration in life, which I feel like a lot of people can relate to. My first question is kind of like why when coming up with Sirad as a character, why was kind of like this description of her important for you?
That's a good question. I think when writing Sirad, I was thinking about the types of things that someone her age could be going through. A lot of it was based on my own experiences and almost, I would say, a bit of a collage of things that had happened to people around me within my community. I wanted Sarah to be someone who was, although at times she made mistakes, she had difficult relationships, she grew in self awareness throughout the book. She was aware of the ways that she perhaps was self sabotaging. Um, and I almost wanted to make sure that she really was a product of her circumstances. You talk about how at times it could be quite frustrating, the decisions that she makes. And a lot of that was to do with the fact that she was parentified. She was in this family structure where all of a sudden she had to be the one who was responsible. There was a lot of like people dealing with mental health struggles around her. And she also carried her own quiet grief and didn't really have that outlet to explore it. But there was a lot of the time, there were also instances where Sirad was very vulnerable and human, and she expressed a desire to want to take care of others, but didn't always have the tools to be able to do that correctly. And throughout the book, I wanted to really show that character arc. So I didn't want to start off with this perfect character who is wholly likable in every way and has the answers for everything. I wanted her to start from a place where actually not having the answers for things is why she went to seek the answers. And she's taking a walk along Greenwich, along the River Thames in Greenwich, and she is thinking about her place in the world. She's thinking about who she is, who she's supposed to become, um, and that sort of lamentation and sort of rage is the perfect backdrop for the journey that will ultimately change her life. So I wanted Sarah to be quite layered, um, sometimes quite deeply empathetic, and other times, unfortunately, quite selfish. And that's why the journey was, I guess, things become problematized because of those competing aspects of her character.
No, that's really beautiful. And again, you've mentioned that, when you're coming up with her character, it had to be kind of like something that was relatable and someone her age was going through. And again, I feel like that's very much the point because, if you look at a lot of immigrant families, oftentimes maybe the oldest daughters or the oldest son, whichever, really takes on that parental role quite early on. And I think, I don't know if it happens to you, but even as a young age, you would get like legal documents to read because, your parents oftentimes maybe wasn't able to understand the level of English. And you're like, read this. And you have already the responsibility to read this important letter and translate it back to them in a way that is understandable, but also really explains what's in the letter. That already kind of puts a lot of pressure on a child or a person. And so when you do talk about it, and just to give more details, the mother is not able to work anymore because she's going through a lot of struggles, and we will talk about the mother in a little bit. But that already, she lost her job, and her brother is, in school, can't work at the moment. That puts, mainly the responsibility on Tirad, and how that affects someone mentally. It's very challenging, and I feel like again it's very relatable. Oftentimes the children in the house probably earn more than the parents because immigrant parents probably are doing a lot of service level jobs, and so the parents have struggled and sacrificed a lot for the children to go to good schools and get good jobs. And so you now are in this position where you're now supposed to give back and have that parental role. And I think you touched on that really well, and kind of like, what does that mean for the child that now has to become a parent? But since we're talking about the early kind of display of the family of Siraj as a character, I would like to talk on about the dad and how essentially the dad left to go back to Somalia early on into the transition to London. Um, I wanted to ask you, why was that kind of important for you to have done that as a character? That the dad leaves to go back. why was that kind of like one of the character arcs that you thought that it was necessary to put in?
I felt that it was quite a necessary exploration just in this book. I don't think when I write this story that I'm implying that this is like allegorical and this is the British Somali experience. However, I wanted to explore the idea that some someone could migrate somewhere and find that the place is not for them, and how that breaks down a family, and how that experience taints everything else around it, and what that does to a growing young woman, and her sense of self and her sense of identity. And that is carried as like a quiet thread throughout the book. And this sense of something being missing from Sirad is present a lot in those first couple of chapters before she goes to Sirad, and it continues as well, and is actually quite intensified because she goes to the parallel world and finds that her parents are still married over there, and that things are completely different. And even though they are going through their own difficulties, there is a sense of assured there is a sense of ease there, and they're almost a lot more accepting of their circumstances. Although that's quite different with her double, Ubah, who is feeling completely the opposite and wants to change her circumstances and escape them in her own ways. So the smell of frankincense and how that reminds her of her father's last day is just, I guess, a symbol of how even the smallest, I would say, the smallest piece of everyday, um, paraphernalia, like frankincense in a Somali home, carries so much meaning, and it can be associated with really difficult memories, and it can be associated with perhaps a time of Sirad's life where she didn't have the answers to why her father couldn't stay, but she has some sort of idea of why, because she remembers him saying that he would rather go back to Somalia and start a new family and just continue things from there. So I felt that having that sense of grief present throughout the book was something that carried the story forward. And I also intentionally didn't want to arrive at this conclusion where Sirad has finally accepted everything, and she meets her dad in the main timeline again, and they talk things out, because that's not always true to life for a lot of people, and I wanted the book to be as true to life as possible.
Yeah, and I think that touches again on how I mentioned in the beginning. There's so many kind of unanswered questions, and especially with the dad, when we were reading it through Sirad, she mentions that, with her mom, she explained they would have conversations about it as adults. And then with her younger son, Ahmed, he would explain to him in a kind of like childish manner why he's leaving, and kind of like make it all very like butterfly and simple. But she was at an age where she wasn't that young and she wasn't that much of an adult, like you're not going to explain to a child. I think she was 7 8. And so it was kind of very interesting, because if you're reading it through her eyes, the dad never explains to us why he leaves, really. I know he says he wants to leave, but she, at a point she says, what does he mean that by that? Is it wants to leave the family, wants to leave London, wants to leave this area? There's quite, again, few unanswered question, and as you mentioned, we don't really get to have a conversation with him. They never do meet after, even in the main timeline, and in the alternate timeline, it's not really the dad. And there was she had quite a few times where the dad in the alternative lifetime is not her dad, so she couldn't really have that kind of hatred or like displease with him, because they're not the same person. But yeah, on the dad, and I think just to go on that a little bit further, there's a section I'll read from the book which kind of talks about them, even though they've left their home, they haven't left their home kind of like mentally. The resonance and the image and the love for their home is always there and in their heart. And I would say that it's very much for a lot of immigrant parents. Um, the need for them to leave their home was survival, and oftentimes there's always a dream to go back and kind of rebuild, or restart from where they've left off. And you've kind of explained that quite well in a section that I will just have a quick read now. So this says, they talk about Somalia every day, sometimes all day. There is a desperation in their voices when they speak about going back and being part of the rebuild for a better future. They find their great pleasures in embellishing these plans with the minute details and then tearing them all up at the end with the hopeless talk of systematic corruption that will never let the people thrive. Maybe this is it. We all wonder. This small called island. And just reading that is literally my dad to a T. Like he will speak about Nigeria all the time, every time. But then it's just that little bit of a fraction, it will be like there's so much corruption. It's just, it feels like it's just a lost hope. Like it's just too hard, too big of a project to start off with. And so that portrayal of a Somali gathering, of a Nigerian gathering, is oftentimes very the same rhetoric or the same need and want and love for their kind of like their home. And so just to touch on like home on that, that was quite well represented, and I would say. And yeah, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that is quite an interesting excerpt that you picked out there, and I do think it's a very shared frustration with a lot of immigrant children because their parents almost have this one foot in and one foot out, where they have their home here, they have their community, the people that they've kind of built bonds with, but then a part of them is planning to go back to their home countries and build homes and live there for the rest of their life. But the fact is, for a lot of them, it's almost this sense of um, anxiety about what life would be there and what would find them there and things like that. So the act of dreaming and hoping and imagining that future almost becomes the comfort itself rather than actually going and facing the reality of what it actually is. So it's interesting how I show in the book that both the family, like the elders around Sirat and Sirat themselves, both take comfort in an imagined version of Somalia. For Sirad, it's the parallel world, which isn't the actual main timeline. And for her family, it's the one that they speak about and the one that they sort of hold in their regard in their everyday conversation. So it's interesting how the reality for what Somalia is isn't fully confronted by either generation in the story.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I really enjoyed that, and yeah. Okay, so just to go into a little more details in the first few chapters, essentially, she gets invited to this unclassified project. Which again, another question is why her? Why did she get invited? The but yeah, it was really like I was just like, what? How? But that was really good. She gets invited to this unclassified project where essentially she gets on a bus and travels through alternate timeline. The whole concept was so interesting because I feel like again, as immigrant parents or as an immigrant yourself or hand generation immigrant, you often feel like, okay, what if they hadn't left? What if, how would my life have been? You know, my life now is dictated by a lot of the factors of where I am, where I live, and that's how I've built myself. So I am who I am because of other people and the circumstances and the environment that I'm in. And so obviously if I was born and remained somewhere else, I would be someone else that's different. But you often feel like, and you want to tell yourself that no, I am who I am because I am. Like I'm not. You don't oftentimes want to accept that actually it's a lot of the exterior factors that build who you are. But essentially, she gets to meet her other half, or well, I guess the mirror of the family who stayed, and she gets to meet her dad, her mom, and her sister, and herself. Um, and the life there isn't that glamorous, as you've explained. Isn't that glamorous? They are going through a lot of hardship, and again, it's quite interesting to see again, as you mentioned, it's not romanticized. You know, they are going through hardship, but there's also goodness. There's it's a race of goodness that you can see. For example, the parents are still together, and you can kind of feel that sense of love between them. but which you can't see in the, in the main timeline. So there's, you can compare it and say, there's quite a few hardships and also some light. um I kind of wanted to kind of touch on, I guess, that quick high preview that we saw of their family now. For how did you come up with that, kind of like the mom and dad, and kind of like how they were coexisting and the reason why they didn't leave? uh
Yeah, I would say it's a combination of all of those things. Partly, just observing the families that I visited when I went to Somalia. The families that I'm in touch with today, and their stories and the things that they love about the country and the things that they wish were different. Pure imagination, just sort of watching videos of people in Mogadishu talking like the aesthetics of the country, and also partly what I remember from visiting. So it's just like the rest of the other book, part imagination, part biography, part observation of those around me. Yeah, and I think to be able to do that allowed me to present a version of Somali that I think is highly personal. I wasn't aiming for factual, to be as factual as possible. I wanted it to be Sirad Somalia, the one that was in the backdrop of her dreams, of her confusion, of her grief and her joy. Like it wasn't going to be this cut and dry geographical depiction.
and yeah, again, I think you've done that really well. I feel like oftentimes you can kind of smell certain ways you described the aesthetics, and you can kind of see it with
Mm.
the sand description and the camels, and you can almost see how it is compared to how you really described the kind of London and in Greenwich and walking through the River Thames at night, and you've described the billboards, but now you've also described life in Somalia, and you can kind of see the difference and the comparisons. And I think you've done that really well, that you can almost see it. But yeah, just on that kind of like, I guess we can fast forward. Migrations or the transport through the unclassified project is that you're able to go through alternative timeline and see how life would have been if they hadn't left. So that way is fine. It's kind of 1 day journey and you're supposed to come back. However, on the way back, it's not fine. People there are not allowed to come and kind of see how their life would have been if they did leave. Which is quite interesting. I guess you can kind of use that comparison in life now, how it's okay, there's loads of programs and aid programs that support, we like monthly aid travels to
Mm.
the global south, and you can go there and like provide aid and do volunteering and do be a good person and all. But there isn't really programs where you can come to the UK and even for a short term come to the UK and see how the UK is, or the global north. Which is quite interesting. Again, I think you've highlighted, I'm not sure if it's intentional or not intentional, kind of explored how going there is fine. However, there's no thing as the bus back. It doesn't really exist. Um, which again, if you just want to talk about like immigration and how we have seen, and obviously this was set in the backdrop of Brexit, and so there's a lot of talk on immigrations and how they're coming and there's so many of them. And just on that, I wanted to kind of talk about like how you can almost sense the feeling of immigrants in the UK, and you've described it really well. Um, do you were you remembering how Brexit happened and how you felt in that time, or was it more of an description of how it would be like if this alternative reality was a real thing?
Mm. Um, that's a good point that you mentioned. Brexit. Brexit is also briefly mentioned in the book, because it's set in 2016. It's that summer where we had the referendum, where we had to make a decision about Brexit, and that discussion was a gateway to so many other sentiments around immigration and belonging and what it means to be British. So I think that conversation was happening quietly in the background. And it's something that Sarah doesn't explicitly engage with. However, she's constantly looking back at her own memories of what it meant to be British, that time where she became a naturalized citizen with her family, the time at school where she was made to feel slightly different, even though she didn't have complicated feelings about who she was. But others seem to project that onto her. And um, and in the book, the idea that you could get on this London bus and go to a parallel world in Somalia is bizarre. I mean, it's crazy, but it's almost like the London bus is meant to be the symbol of Britishness. It's an iconic image, that red London bus. And imagining that somewhere in Somalia by the sea, um, it's a little bit crazy, but I wanted it to feel very far-fetched, because I think having that contrast of Britishness and Somaliness, the sea, the markets of Somalia with the camels and the trees and everything, is something that could only really happen in literature if you think about it. Everywhere on the world else in the world, it's like, okay, we'll explain how that works. And of course, in literature there is that explanation. But if you can really steep the book in the right atmosphere, and you have the right message, then you can get your readers to really accept that this is something that has happened, and to engage with it, and to feel the feelings, and to ask themselves what if. There is in the story the rules of this parallel world where you can only visit once, and Sarah is only allowed to visit once, which is why she only goes there in the beginning once. And then later on in the second half, you find that um, the the tracks and the routes for this parallel world still exist, but they are being used by people to go to Somalia for their own means. And you find again later in the book why her husband is so heavily involved in that world. So I think what I wanted to say about immigration in the story is, whilst we're having all of the, I would say, discourse about immigration in 2016, and still to this day, but I remember it being very, very much a topic in all the papers, in every conversation, all the talk shows in 2016. Sirad is navigating her own sense of belonging and understanding what that her migration meant through this parallel world. So it's almost like this tension between the real factual world that's happening and the one that she's experiencing, which is extremely bizarre and no one would believe, but somehow it's happening. And there's rumor around. She hears people talking about this bus, and even her mum mentioned it towards the beginning, and she kind of brushes it off. So it's almost like, you know, there's a personal sense of travel and migration, and then there's the political, and both of those personal and political spheres sometimes bump up against each other, and sometimes they kind of coexist. There is a scene in the book where Sirad is getting ready to go to Salutation Road, where she's going to be asked and interviewed about her experience traveling on the bus. And up to this point, all she knows is called Unclassified. It's a project run by some university students, by some unnamed London university. So there's a lot of like secrecy there. And then while she's getting ready, she's watching on the news some immigrants who had just come through the English Channel. Some of them had come on boats, and there's a bit of a reception for them. And there's a question about where will they go? What will life be like for them? What have they escaped? And um, it's almost like she's now forced, because she's gone to this parallel. She's now forced to think about these questions and try to find some answers.
Yeah, perfect. And just as you kind of explained that really well, to carry on that, Uber does find her way through, the somehow to come back, to come to London. And when they did meet the first time, she did express her need to want to have more, and she felt that she couldn't get that in Somalia. And so she was already planning and plotting a way for her to come to the UK and get the bus kind of like on the parallel time and come. Um, Sirad never really explains to her how her life in the UK is. Sirad did experience how her life Uber's life is in Somalia. However, I felt like there wasn't really that much of a conversation of how she's experiencing life. And, we've spoke about in the first few chapters, we get a detail of how actually it's not all that glamour in the UK for her. Her mum is not that well. All of her responsibility is on herself. She's working in a job that she doesn't really like, etc., etc. She feels that she doesn't belong. And so I feel like there wasn't really that much of a conversation between the two about that.
Yeah, that is an interesting point that you mentioned. Throughout their exchange, Sirad and Abah try to, they do have conversations about life and questions around what Abah will do in London, what her life is like in Somalia, etc. And through, I would say, through more of an internal stream of consciousness, Sirad is exploring memories of early life in London. For example, there is that chapter where she explains how her mum used to know someone who lived in their area where they were taking benefits that they weren't entitled to, and she was trying to explore the significance of that. Um, and I think because Sirad has um, this sense of responsibility towards others to take care of them, even though it's not always fully realized. She can't quite see a place for her own struggles in the world. She doesn't quite find that there is someone who could perhaps be a listening ear for her, who could offer her some kind of resolution. Although she does find people such as Maxine who love to hear about her experiences, who love to share a lot of wisdom, who are really soothing and help her kind of get through the anxieties of growing up and coming of age. I think her relationship with Ubah is quite different, where she feels like she needs to protect Ubah from something rather than um, seek her support. And I use Somali proverbs at the beginning of my chapters to kind of explore this world. And a lot of them are very common proverbs. And one of them, which is my favorite, is on chapter 7, and it's either be a mountain or lean on one. And the lesson there is either be someone who is someone that others can turn to for support, be their strength, um, be their hope in a way, or lean on one, or be vulnerable, or offer your difficulties and allow others to give you the advice. And that's the lesson of the chapter. And it's almost something that Sirat fails to do. She wants to protect Ubah from this almost underbelly of London where she's undocumented. She's found her way on a bit of a whim. She's full of naiveties. And in that position, Sirad wants to be the one to help her and to help her settle in and to protect her from any dangers. But what she forgets is that perhaps the best type of bond is where you can also offer your own difficulties and allow others to be there for you as well. So that's something that she struggles to do. But I think she finds that support system in Maxine, this older, much more seasoned, wiser person who represents comfort because she's in that library where Sirad associates with comfort. So maybe that's her place where she can just sort of not be so not be so on duty all the time and allow herself to be taken care of.
Yeah. It was really interesting because I bring this up because oftentimes there is a two-way communications between either people that are still in the global south, quote unquote, that kind of talk about their struggles and kind of like their day-to-day lives and the difficulties that they face. And there's also the other side of maybe people that live in the global north, which they we're still going through a lot of different difficulties and struggles in our day-to-day life, but oftentimes what I've observed is that our kind of like the difficulties of someone living in the global north doesn't necessarily translate as much as a kind of like barrier to people living in the global south, because they're not necessarily the same, and they're viewed slightly differently. And which was kind of interesting because I wanted it to explore that a little bit more on how in the book that wasn't the case. We heard a lot of Uber struggles, and we do definitely feel that kind of like sorrow for her. However, as you know, I don't think there was the sorrow felt for what Sirad is going through, and oftentimes maybe it's downplayed what she's going through because she's living in the global north, and so you have a lot of other benefits. So yeah, I thought that was really a good insight. I guess now I just wanted to go into kind of like a little bit fast forward. Um, Oba gets basically she goes missing, and we don't know where she is after that short time of enjoyment that they had between the two. And yes, Siraj gets called back to kind of talk about, finally gets to talk about like her experience and review about the unclassified project, her first time she went back. And as she was leaving, she was asked to kind of talk about Uber, where is she. They know that she somehow managed to get to London. And so they ask her to kind of give us more information. And as a reader, I was like, surely there's no way she's gonna give information of where she is, snitch, quote unquote. But yeah, she does. And, she does come back the next day and does fill a form. And I don't know, as a reader, I was disappointed, but I was also very much understanding. And there was just a few bits that I was like, it makes sense. They are going to offer her money and they do need money. It's very much detailed and expressed in the book that they are having a lot of financial difficulties. I think a lot of the sorrow in the family is coming because of all the debt that they need. And so that money is very much useful. And on one side, it will be foolish to give that money up. On the other side, you're thinking, no way, that basically sisters are the same person. She wouldn't betray her. And I think, again, maybe it's just me reading into this a lot more, but what I felt was kind of like, oftentimes you have immigrants in the UK, for example, that have come a long time ago and they're kind of neutralized, and they have been here for so long that they've accepted a lot of the social norms. And oftentimes when the new immigrants come, quote unquote, it's almost this feeling of acceptance, but also acceptance at a condition. I think there's even an ease about new immigrants coming, and it kind of feels like even the immigrants are thinking there's too many of them now, or they're coming with their kind of like ideologies and new norms, and yeah, we accept them, of course. However, that we are feeling on edge. It's almost as if they're gonna take up a space. There's kind of like, yeah, we allow them, but not too much, and it's kind of feels like you forget that you're also an immigrant. And so I think that display of what happened there kind of made me think of how sometimes if an immigrant that's been here for so long had an opportunity to maybe return back a few new undocumented immigrants, I feel like some of them would. And it's because kind of like a way to save themselves. And I don't know again if this was intentional, but I feel like that was kind of what was going on here. Even though it wasn't done for the reason to like turn her back as more financial gain, I feel like there was somehow a an underlying reasons as to why she felt comfortable enough to write that feedback, kind of like telling them what she is and helping them to get Uber back. And I feel like that was a kind of good parallel of how in real life there's certain um, feelings of different immigrants. And so you have undocumented immigrants and maybe you have the legal immigrants, and there's somehow a feelings towards one another that might not be necessarily uh displayed in real life. Does that make sense? It was that essentially what I'm asking, like, was that done on purpose to display that, or
That's really interesting when that you asked if it's done on purpose. And I always say one of the most magical things about writing is that sometimes you'll write something, but the meanings and the deeper layers and those intricacies of meaning and how maybe a certain symbol will connect with another symbol can sometimes be quite unintentional. So it's I write with an awareness that there would be things like this that come out of the narrative that others pick out, but not all of them are completely intentional. And I think, when Sirad did that to betray Ubah, it was almost like, you know, I wanted to almost show that dark side of this overly done regard for someone who is more vulnerable, of the power that Sirad perhaps possessed as someone coming from, this side of coming from the UK, and also on this in this timeline. And sometimes that power gets abused. And I don't think Sirad ever had intentions to specifically betray or hurt Ubah. She knew what she was going through, and she did care for her and want to see her do well. But I think when faced with the realities that she was facing with her family, struggling financially, needing that money just to almost put a band aid on their problems, and feeling that she had a responsibility first to her mother and her brother, and that everything that she'd went through was there to make essentially her life easier and better, as was originally promised by the unclassified project. She takes that money. She does hesitate, but she takes that money because there's a part of her that feels that maybe she can't look after Ubah in the way that she wants to, and that Ubah might encounter some danger here if she were to stay. Because she does at one point express that she is her own person. She's a separate person, and though maybe they may came from similar circumstances, they're both born there in Somalia, life and time treated them differently, and that Zira can't feel responsible for Ubah. So I think when she kind of added all of that up together, she decided that that money would do more good than harm, and perhaps, you know, selfishly and naively, because she does later on in the book realize that she didn't move on from the mistake that she made, and she tried to bury the past, but it kept catching up with her. So she needs to seek that redemption. But what I wanted to say is that um, relations between immigrants and other types of immigrants is something that I wanted to explore. I think in most immigrant literature, it's always this one way exchange where it's like an immigrant comes to their new land and it's them getting to grips with that and coming to an understanding with the people that already lived there, and is usually can be quite cut and dry, even though the complexities of it have been very well explored in literature. I wanted to write a story about different types of immigrants and how that experience is very complex and layered. It's not black and white. Um, there are perhaps those who have fled circumstances like war and displacement, and who finally find a sense of home here, and maybe don't want that for others. And like you said, it's a sense of fear that they might be replaced and their space is taken. So there's a scarcity mindset. And then it doesn't help that in the media, all they're talking about is immigrants and the negative side of things and who's going to pay for this cost. And so I think Sirad, unfortunately and unwittingly, becomes a product of that type of environment, a product of the anti immigrant sentiment. And the book shows that you really can't escape that poisonous thinking in the way that you think you can. And Sirad had to grow through her mistakes to understand that, yeah, she's no one's savior, essentially.
Yeah, no, that was really, really well done. Yes, again, to kind of like again fast forward through the timeline, she's done that, and she basically very much never forgives herself. She, again, like you've mentioned, she tries to kind of bury it and kind of move on with her life. And part two of the book kind of talks about how she got married, and she's going through her own marriage life difficulties, which we might not be able to touch on now. However, she has another opportunity to go back and ask for forgiveness to Uber. Or has it's been several years now, and again, like I've mentioned in the beginning, there's quite a few sorrows and questions that went kind of like never answered for the reader, which I enjoyed, which kind of make you think. I think one of them was the fact that Uber didn't forgive her, and as a reader, I I expected, you go through this journey, she's gonna express her feeling, how she's sorry, and she didn't do it maliciously, and Uber's going to be like, okay, yes, that's fine, and kind of is going to be tied up in a very pretty bow, and the story would end. However, you hear that, Uber's going through her life and she's evolved, she's forgotten, well, she's tried to forget, and she's moved on as much as she could. However, it didn't really end really well. That wasn't, even though she did go back thinking, yes, this is it, this is going to fix things, she's going to forgive me, and so I can now, it can alleviate my struggles. It didn't happen that way. Again, I wanted to ask you, why was it important, I guess, for that relationship to go that way where, it didn't end well?
Hmm. That's a good point. I think when I was writing that chapter, I really tried, throughout while I was writing the book, I really tried to not make her, I would say, like the answer to Sirad's
Mm,
problems. And I think initially there is that promise, isn't there, with the parallel world and with what Unclassified say, that this world could offer answers. And when Sirad meets Ubah, she finds that she is her own person. She's going through her own difficulties. She has her own aspirations, her own dreams, and none of her trajectory doesn't stop just because Siraj shows up. She doesn't stop wanting what she wants. She doesn't stop having her personality, how headstrong she is, and how focused she is as a person. And she has her own flaws as well. So when Sirad does the unforgivable and she betrays her for her own comfort, and then years later goes there seeking forgiveness, what she finds is that for the very first time, Ubah is the one to enlighten her about this and to let her know about the violence of the unclassified project, the violence of seeing um, one's homeland as nothing more than an element of character development, and seeing it as nothing more than this backdrop where they can live out their fantasies of becoming a good person. Um, and that at the end of the day, Ubah did suffer the consequences of that mistake. But then she also went on and made her own mistakes. So she doesn't want to victimize herself and suggest that she was always doing the right thing and that she was just the one that was wronged. But at the same time, she doesn't really agree with this structure of coming on a London bus for a few moments to Somalia, changing the lives of people there through perhaps some careless decision making, and then just going back to her comfort. She really wanted Sarah to know that there was no clear answer at the end of that visit, and that what the most she could really do for her is just kind of let her on her way. And it's heartbreaking because we do want to realize, I guess, that relationship between Sarah and Uma. We want to see them get on. We want to see them understand each other. And there are still elements of understanding because there is that bit where Uba yells at Sarad and says, "Actually, you're just like me. You are selfish, just like me." And perhaps there's that moment of clarity between them. Um, but at the same time, what I wanted to show is that despite that difficult moment where Sarah didn't get what she wanted and she didn't get that "I forgive you," she is still able to go back to London and she's still able to eventually pick up the pieces and continue living, pick up the pieces and live with more intention. And perhaps that experience did more good for her than she could have ever imagined.
mm. Yeah, that was really good, and I really enjoyed the part of, when she does come back, you kind of feel like, oh, this is, there's going to be the start of a moment where she's uncertain about a lot of things and sorrow. However, it kind of, she uses that time to give her the strength that she needs. She does take some solitude. She does leave her husband for a while, stays in a hotel. And I think she uses that time to kind of think and really contemplate and get herself together. And again, just lastly, there was a moment where her husband does come and find her in the old house, and he says that, I'll be downstairs, etc., which there was a really good point where, we don't necessarily know if he did wait downstairs or not in the car, or if he did leave. But I guess as a reader, you can kind of like make your own conclusions at that point. And again, I really enjoyed how you didn't provide all the answers to everything. But I think it was really important how we do see that arc of Sirad from the beginning of how, as a in her 20s, what she's going through. And a lot of the time, she is still going through a lot of those uncertainties in her 30s. But I think her mindset has changed, and the way she sees things has definitely changed. She does still make some rash decisions that are questionable. However, it's very much human and relatable. And I really enjoyed the kind of like the last bit of, will day or one day type of love that they have for each other. And we see that the things that connect the both of them is actually a lot more than what lets to the eye. He does also go back on the unclassified journey. I think again, I would my question would be on why was it important for you not at the end not to be like, they get in a car together and go, and they now live a happy life. And you didn't also mention that fact that she's pregnant now, or she's not, they didn't have a child. So again, you didn't end it all like pretty, which is
Mm.
good but also quite frustrating for the reader.
Yeah, it is frustrating, and actually, I say this as a reader as well, who loves to read a book where I feel like, okay, there is this resolution, and now I can live and continue the rest of
Yeah,
my
you can
day
close the book
knowing
and be like,
my
ah.
business. Yeah, but I think that was intentional for my book that I didn't tie things up because the question throughout the book is what if? And it's always a sense of what if something else happened? What if this small change didn't happen? So it was fitting for the end that whilst Omar was waiting for Sirad and he gave her the option of coming down and us and them going together, there is also the sense of what if she did miss the car, and what if he did drive away and it was too late for her? How would her life be? Who would Sarad be? And would she be okay with that? And I mean, I like to write my characters in a way where I see themselves almost living on beyond the book, beyond whatever I can project onto them and imagine for them. And what I imagine for someone like Sirad and Umar is that they continue living, hopefully together, and that he is still waiting, and that even though he told her he's only going to wait until the end of that radio show, he lingers on for a little bit longer because regardless, he still loves her and they have such a shared history, even though it took them such a long time to be able to open up about that. They both come from very similar circumstances where they were searching for this sense of belonging and purpose, and they were really good to each other until Sirad needed that moment to understand actually, how did I find myself here? I need to be able to just take a breather and accept myself and gather myself before I go back into my marriage and continue. So I think he holds so much space for her to be her messy self but come back to him, and he accepts that. And I think it's a contrast to that conversation where she went to Uber and she didn't find that comfort, she didn't find that accepting, she didn't find that acceptance, sorry. With Umar it's something completely different. He does accept her despite everything, and she also accepts him, so it's two-way. I really wanted to leave it open ended to let readers just kind of imagine what would be the most loving ending. Do they think Sirad is capable of pushing behind her everything that has happened and just continuing her life with Umar, or is she still lost? And the idea of still being lost despite all of the journeying and the migration is ever present because this is true to life. A lot of times you never feel like you've quite arrived, and Sirad never feels like she's quite arrived ever in this book, despite moving from Greenwich, moving to this place where she's really proud of. She's proud of her home, she's proud of her job, but there is a sense of her that she's still lost. So I wanted there to be that sense of being lost, but also a lot of love at the end. Yeah.
Mhm. Oh, thank you so much. Honestly, I really enjoyed your presence here and the conversation that we've had. I found it really insightful. And yeah, I would love to say, well done on this debut book. It was really, really good. Loved it. Was a lovely read, and I would definitely recommend everyone that's listening to have a look at the book and purchase it. Just so lastly, one thing that I like to ask my guests is kind of like any action points or thing that you would like the reader to take forward and I guess implement in their lives. And this can be a reader that's maybe a listener that's maybe interested in writing a book, or it can be a listener that's not interested in writing a book that maybe is interested in exploring migration or anything like that. I guess what action points would you, one thing that you want them to remember or take away from this encounter with you?
Yeah, thank you so much, by the way, Zainab, for inviting me. I found this such an enriching discussion. And every time I talk about Salutation Road, I see it from a new lens. So it's really lovely to see your take on the book. My key takeaway for a reader or anyone listening would definitely be to explore writing, not just as a tool of working towards a finished piece, but just as a tool of like understanding yourself. It's very therapeutic to be able to put pen to paper and just, I would say, reminisce on your memories and things that make you who you are. For any writer out there who is struggling to come up with an idea for a book that they find would be compelling and authentic, I would say the best thing to do, and this is why I always advise readers, writers, is to just look around your daily environment and the everyday things that make your life. So that could be like maybe a particular route that you take to work or conversations that you have with a family member or a friendship that's really dear to you. I think you don't have to go too far to be able to seek inspiration. Sometimes it can come from the simplest things, and sometimes it's the simplest things that hold the most meaning and have the most, I guess, interesting arc that you can develop into a story. So look into that. I would encourage you to read as widely as possible if you're trying to work, if you're trying to write a book, because you can never be too inspired. And every day there are, I would say, there are new works coming out which offer a different angle on a topic that we think we've already explored. So lots of incredible immigrant fiction coming out, African fiction coming out. Read across your genre, read different genres. Try to spend a lot of time with yourself. I think solitude is probably one of the best aids to anyone who is a creative, just being able to listen to your own mind and um, step away from the other voices and understand who you are and what moves you. I love to spend a lot of time alone. In fact, it was that walk that I make along the bank of the River Thames in Greenwich that inspired this book. And that's the very first scene in Salutation Road where Siride is walking along the river and just having a bit of a rant about life. So, yeah, sometimes it's the simplest, mundane, everyday things that can really inspire us.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so, so much. It's been a pleasure to have you on. And yeah, I wish you all the best in all your other books. And yeah, I'm excited to read them. Uh,
Thank you, Zainab. See you.